I'm joined now by Angus Hanton, who was kind enough to join me for a downstream a few years ago to discuss his book, Vassal State. I think it was a real agenda setter, may I say. Still very much worth reading, Vassal State, How America Runs Britain. I would say even more worth your time now than it was 2-3 years ago. Angus, thanks for coming back.
Thank you very much.
A fabulous book. I do often blow smoke up people's backsides about their book, but this one really is very good. And I read it and I thought, this is great, very useful. And it's one of those that it really outperformed expectations. It's got hundreds of thousands of views. Really worth your time. We've got you back on to really talk about Britain and its relationship to America in the context of what's going on in the Middle East, West Asia. Before we do talk about the questions relevant to current affairs in early 2026,
yes,
quickly, just relay the conversation you were trying to catalyse with the publication of this book, Vassal State.
Well, what I was saying was people don't realise how much of the UK is owned by American corporations. And it's not just that they own a lot, but they employ a lot of Brits. They employ 2 million Brits, not 1 million. So a lot of us work for Americans. And I was also trying to show how difficult it is to get information about this. So I really struggled at the beginning of the research. And eventually I found that the best information was held by American government, which they shared. But it wasn't just that. The British weren't interested in finding out more, and they're still not. They should by now have set up a department to monitor foreign ownership and to think about what they should do about it. So that was the gist of where I started, that a lot more is owned by America than people think. But then I found that what they own is actually really significant. They don't just own a lot of our businesses. They own the really important businesses. They own the businesses through which we trade with each other. So they own things like Airbnb and eBay and Amazon, where you might be buying something from a British company as a Brit, and you're paying an American for doing the privilege, of doing business. And it's not just the platforms like that they own, but they also own our media, our social media. So our town square is controlled mostly from California. So one of the things that I realized was that this control of our businesses and our society and our social media overspills into control of our politics. And I gave a couple of examples in the book where the British essentially were told not to buy from China, and the Americans insisted on it, even though the British wanted to. So that was the Huawei scandal. And there have been many other cases that are public, and of course even more that aren't public, where the Americans are quietly dictating what we do. And their control was bad enough 2 years ago when I wrote the book, but of course it's really come into its own now in the last since Trump came back to power, and certainly since the Iran war, it's become apparent that being the vassal of another state really matters.
Quickly on Huawei, it was kind of a verboten thing to talk about 2 years ago. Somebody like myself who doesn't mind, making enemies in legacy media, because I'm fortunate enough to have, Novara, I would have said, look, this means we're not going to develop 5G and roll it out as quickly as we otherwise would have. It's going to cost us billions. This stuff is central to building a modern economy. You have to have a very good excuse to not do this. Huawei is the global number one with regards to 5G technology. Nokia and Ericsson do it as well, but they're not as good. BT said that when we originally got them in. Has it dawned on the British media and political class in the last 2 years, since you wrote this book, really, has it dawned on them that actually we've made a series of very bad economic decisions in the name of the special relationship? I
don't think it has. I mean, one of the things we've done is we've sacrificed our manufacturing industry. It used to be that 20 years ago, manufacturing was 25% of the economy. It's now 10%. And we've instead replaced it with the financial services industry. And that's very much based in the southeast. So that has accentuated national divisions, but it's also increased the power of the US because they dominate these sectors. And of course, things like AI are likely to be much more of a threat to financial services than they are to manufacturing.
So leaning into a service-based economy actually makes us much more vulnerable to
I think so, but much more vulnerable to the people who control the computers, basically, the people who to the US, to Silicon Valley in particular.
And how much worse is it here than Europe? You said 2 million people in this country work for American firms. What is that as a situation compared to France, Italy, Germany, Netherlands?
It's far worse, far worse. I mean, in Germany, the number is about 400,000. In France, it's about 300,000.
Wow.
Down in Italy and Spain, the next two biggest European countries, it's around 100,000 in each of those countries working for US corporations. So it's far worse. We're much more, as it were, invaded, and I don't mean to use an unusually pejorative term, but we're much more dominated economically by American corporations than any of those countries. And it's public information. It's in the figures that the Internal Revenue Service have published about the turnover of the multinationals. So one can see it. It's not only that they employ more people here, it's that they have more turnover here, more profits here, and in particular, they pay less tax. I mean, the Europeans have been, of course, there's a streak of anti-Americanism, and I'm not being anti-American in any of this. I'm recognizing their economic power. In some ways, I'm respecting it. But there is a streak of anti-Americanism in Europe, and that has helped them to protect their industries and their politics from American influence. But there's also a degree of nationalism, which we generally aren't great fans of nationalism as a slogan. But in terms of economic nationalism, it means having your businesses controlled locally and having the profits given back to a more local community. And the Germans and the French are very, very keen on that, explicitly so. And you can't imagine one of those Mittelstand companies, the kind of German middle-sized companies owned often by a family, often run in a town which is interdependent on the company. You can't imagine those agreeing to takeovers by US companies, and they don't. There's protection at state level, at regional level, and culturally there's protection. So we just don't allow the Germans don't allow their companies to be taken over in the way that we do. I mean, since I wrote the book, there've been a lot more takeovers of UK companies. So Deliveroo, which was London listed, has been taken over by American DoorDash. There've been takeovers in a big control company called Spectris got taken over. A lot of private equity have taken over UK businesses. Often they're businesses you've never heard of, but they really matter, sort of in pensions and control systems. A lot of takeovers have carried on since then, and a lot more, as it were, vultures are circling because British companies tend to be underpriced. And another result of that is that British companies sometimes relist in the US.
People hear that a lot. British firms are underpriced. That's why predatory US capital is really one reason why it's really enamored with them. Why are British firms underpriced?
I think they're underpriced because because their prospects aren't so good, and that's partly a result of government strategy, government or lack of strategy. It's partly because they're at a competitive disadvantage in many areas, and perhaps it's also because we've freed up our financial services so much that we encourage people to invest their pensions in US companies and in foreign companies instead of what we used to do when ISAs were. Individual savings accounts were preceded by things called something called PEPs, private equity plans, and the rule for those was that you could only invest in UK equities. We've opened our economy. It's a good thing in many ways to have an open economy, but there's a degree of there's open, and we've opened it so much that we've basically set up a jumble sale of our businesses.
There's open and there's vulnerable, right?
Exactly.
So quickly on ISAs replacing PEPs, for people of my age in their early 40s, just about remember that term PEPs. This was something that changed under Gordon Brown, is that right?
Yes, that's right. And they allowed them, they changed but it wasn't just that they changed the name of them and the rules. They particularly changed the rule about what you could invest in. That you could invest in cash, that's fair enough, but that also you could invest in foreign companies. And there was talk of Rachel Reeves limiting some of these investments. In fact, she just limited the amount you could put into cash ISAs, but she could have limited it and said no new investments outside the UK.
So we give tax benefits to people to invest in foreign companies.
Absolutely, very well put. Yes, we do.
I mean, most people would find that insane. The
Yes.
idea that the exchequer loses out so that people can invest in companies overseas.
Yes, and that's not just in private personal saving like ISAs. That also goes for the whole pension industry, which is very tax advantaged. Yeah.
On the nuclear deterrent, on Trident, is it actually an independent nuclear deterrent?
I don't believe so. And it's interesting, isn't it, how no politician in the last 20 years, or none that I can remember, has used the phrase independent nuclear deterrent. They talk vaguely about nuclear weapons, but it's always been the case that our nuclear weapons, Britain's nuclear weapons, were made in the US. And it seems to me impossible to believe that with the way electronics are so important in weapons systems, that the Americans haven't built in an override that makes it impossible to use these without their permission. If you ask any time in the last few years, if you'd asked British politicians about this, the stock answer was to say, we can't imagine a situation where we would want to use them and the Americans didn't approve, so this doesn't arise. I think we're now in a situation where one perhaps could imagine such a situation. I don't think that they could be used without by Americans without British consent, but I think the converse isn't true. I don't think we could use them without their consent.
Or equally, there's another sort of scenario where Britain does use, and of course, we never want this to happen, but Britain did use a one-off tactical nuclear weapon, and the Americans say, well, you can't use them anymore. Again, that isn't really an independent. If there is some sort of world war and it's catalyzed in the early stages by something that's like that, somebody hits us first, then you use it in retaliation. It's just a singular strike. There's no guarantee that there's an ongoing supply chain of this stuff. Not that you want, a supply chain of nuclear weapons to be deployed, but
no. So we're in the worst of all possible worlds. We've got weapons which make us a target.
Yeah,
very bad.
Yeah,
and we can't use them in the way that we might want. Although perhaps that's a good thing, but it certainly doesn't create the same sort of deterrent as say France has. So France has always insisted that its nuclear weapons are totally under its own control, and they've never become dependent on another country. A very sensible policy decision started really with the independent-mindedness of de Gaulle.
I mean, there'll be people watching or listening to this who are very left-wing, very pacific in their mindset. They might say, well, we don't want to use them. Well, the point is we're paying, upwards of 100 billion. So have that conversation about, getting rid of the deterrent altogether. Right now, this feels like the worst of both worlds.
I agree. I would get rid of them, but that's a personal view. But I think, as I say, we've got the worst of all worlds at the moment. We've got them, but we're not free to use them as we want.
Let's say there's an existential war of some kind. And again, all this is highly unlikely. We're a nuclear power. We're in the northwest of Europe. But again, it's worth talking at the level of abstraction. If there is some kind of existential conflict and Britain's involved, is it able to fight that conflict if America is not on the same side? So all the technology that we have, the aircraft carriers, the F-35s, I know it's not up to scratch right now, but just say we are where we are. Given that level of technological integration in particular, how vulnerable are we? It's the Americans. You've got the Suez crisis in the 50s. The Americans say, at one point, they even threatened to put sanctions on the UK, which is very funny. But they wouldn't even need to do that now, one presumes, because of this technological dependence we have at the military level.
Exactly. I totally agree. We're dependent on them. We're dependent at every level, military as well as... and people don't realise that in military terms, we really are a base for the Americans. I mean, there's been lots of talk about us, Keir Starmer allowing the Americans to use the Air Force bases in Fairford, in Gloucestershire, and Diego Garcia in the Indian Ocean. But there are other Air Force bases which are essentially American, where American currency is used. There are 10,000 military personnel, mostly Air Force, in the UK. 10,000 American military in the UK already. So we are very much a base for them, a European base, whether we like it or not.
And they're spending dollars to buy goods and services on those bases.
On those bases, the currency used is dollars. Absolutely. Well, I mean, if some of the ones in East Anglia, for example, they're just Americans on the base. The British, if they do anything, they do the kind of gatekeeping, literally.
So it's kind of a black box. We don't really know what goes on in there.
No. But the same applies to other countries as well. I mean, you've got the right in the middle of Australia. There's an American base which is completely controlled by by American military personnel, and Australian civilians aren't allowed in.
Is that the case here? Can civilians enter these places? If a British journalist wants to go into...
Oh, I don't think a journalist would be allowed in. I imagine they have a protocol with the British military to allow them in when they need to go in. But we're...
So a British, let's say a member, let's say some dissident member of the cabinet, a latter-day Tony Benn, is in a Labour cabinet, and they say, and they're not even being, anti-American, they're just saying, I want basic accountability of something that's happening in British territory, and if they want to go to that base, they won't be let in.
I don't know. I imagine there must be a sort of procedure where there'd be lots of talk about them being allowed to go in, and they'd have a little tour around, and they'd see nothing, and they'd come out and think they'd seen everything. You know how it is.
But it's at the behest of the Americans, is what you're fundamentally saying.
Yeah, in those bases.
A British politician in the UK.
Yeah, not Fairford, which is different. That's an RAF.
Yeah,
it's a UK RAF base. So, and they wanted to land their planes there, and the Keir Starmer's agreed. But I mean, I would say he agreed sort of because he had to. I mean, from the moment when he said you can't use them to the moment when he changed his mind and said you can, that was 39 hours. And during that 39 hours, he was much criticised by the Americans, and I suspect threatened. Certainly publicly, he was threatened. So I don't think we have a real choice about cooperating. We're doing the British are doing what you would expect a vassal state to do, trying to show loyalty, but try to minimise entanglement. I mean, I've used the word vassal state because a vassal is someone who works for the economic benefit of the master. They do what they're told by the master, but also historically, in medieval times, the vassal would go and fight in wars, often foreign wars, for the master. And that's very similar to the sort of vassalage that we're talking about now.
So from what you're saying, it seems that British involvement in the Iran war is structurally unavoidable. This is not a political choice. Or it may be a political choice, but it's a very, 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 very hard one, which clearly Keir Starmer was rolled over on quite quickly.
Yes. Yeah, Keir Starmer's in a very difficult position unless he wants to really assert British independence. But then, of course, that would have consequential costs.
And what would the cost be?
We're a dependent state. I mean, we've already had threats, haven't we, from Donald Trump that he would cross subject areas, that if there was military resistance to sharing military resources, that he would increase tariffs. They'd use this is why it's so important that their economics and the politics and the military are all intertwined, that we're dependent on all those three levels. And so I don't think Starmer feels he's got a real choice about trying to show support while actually trying to minimize entanglement. I mean, we've also to some extent we've learned from the Iraq War. The mistakes of that were to obviously show support, but then get entangled in it. And obviously, it was a disaster. It didn't lead to any good things for the Brits, and led to lots of bad things. But also, there's a problem with these foreign wars, that it's not us that is involved in deciding who to fight, when to fight, and how to fight. These are the adventures of another country. You mentioned Suez. Well, that was a British sort of end of empire, British adventurism. And here in Iran, we've got American adventurism. Now, in the case when we were essentially after Suez, the junior partner, they could slap us down and tell us off. But if the senior partner in what you might call a partnership, although I see it more as a master-servant relationship, if the senior one has a military adventure, no one can stop them.
So these bases are part of a relationship of vassalage, and the insinuation is that basically we're locked into American foreign policy choices, partly as a result of those bases being here. So then the question is, logically, if we wanted a sovereign, independent foreign policy for this country, would we necessarily then have to remove these bases? Or at least reduce the number of them?
I think we should reduce the number, yes. And of course we could do. I mean, part of the deal was that we tolerate these bases because we recognise that NATO is going to give Britain and Europe a solid defence. But with Trump backing off his support for NATO and and it being open to question whether he would support NATO if necessary, you have to think, well, isn't the deal being broken from that side?
Mm. So you personally would like to see the bases go or to stay, or what's your view? Let's say NATO kicks around a few more years, but it's kind of diminished in power. Because clearly Trump's going to go in a couple of years, but it doesn't seem like the direction of the Republican Party long term is that different.
Well, what's happened is the world had a way. It was organized in a certain way from the time of the war until a year or two ago, with a close relationship, an interdependent relationship between Europe and the US. The US have said in as many words that they want to back off that Europe needs to look after itself, and that America is going to have its sphere of influence, which is going to be the Americas, from North America to South America. It's been rattling its saber over Canada, over Cuba, clearly over Mexico, Venezuela. It wants to have more influence there. It's said as much, and that's its choice. But its support, and it's saying it's not going to have so much support for Europe. So it seems to me that if you're going to have bases, you want European bases, not American bases. So whether there's a European army or an agreement to have exchange with German and French military, that's another thing. So I would have a steady path of reducing those bases, consistent with what America has said it wants.
JD Vance, of course, in Munich, not that long ago, making these precise points.
Yes.
And you'd think these two things align, but then you're called anti-American if you say these things which seemingly dovetail with JD Vance's demands. So we've talked about the integration and the subordination, one might argue, of the UK economy to the United States. We've talked briefly about Trident air bases, liquid natural gas. America is now an energy superpower in a way that it wasn't with the great energy crisis of the early 1970s. How dependent are we in Britain on American LNG, as it's called? How dependent is Europe on American LNG, particularly after the war in Russia? And if we are locked out of energy supplies from the Gulf, or if they're just diminished somewhat, will we become more dependent on US LNG? Are there other global sources we can draw upon?
Well, I think this has made it clear that we need to have an energy independence policy. A lot of Europe is dependent on Russian gas, and it's been unwise for Europe to allow itself to become so dependent on Russian gas. There are a lot of European energy sources. The Germans, in particular, have a lot of renewable energy from solar and wind, and now a lot more batteries. But they still consume a lot of Russian gas. It may be a question of choice. At the moment, it's being seen as a choice between Russian gas or American LNG. But it seems to me we should try and get out of depending on either of those powers, neither of whom has proved themselves trustworthy in the last few months.
Well, the third option is, of course, Chinese renewables, solar panels, lithium batteries. But then, of course, a China hawk would say, well, that's even worse.
Well, it's a slightly different thing. Once you've got the panels, and they're generating your electricity. And if you're if the Chinese stop selling you panels, yes, you've got a problem, but not a short-term problem. So it's not like a tap that can be turned off. So I don't think our dependence on Chinese manufacturer panels is the same sort of problem.
So that's preferable to being dependent on US LNG or Russian oil and gas,
as well as the fact that it's renewable energy. And one of the things, of course, that Donald Trump has stepped back from, reversed, is America's concern for climate change and for global warming.
So where should the UK be getting its energy from? Right now, there's a big conversation that the right-wing press is trying to kick off on with regards to not just oil and gas in the North Sea, which I think is a legitimate conversation. I don't agree with it, but it's a legitimate conversation. But they're even now talking about fracking and bringing back coal. What's your view in terms of what the UK's energy mix should look like going forward into the 2030s?
Well, I agree with Ed Miliband. We should be making it as clean as possible and as rapidly as possible. And if there's more drilling allowed in the North Sea, it should be as a short-term measure in order to promote energy independence and not in order to move back to oil. And I think the technologies are changing so rapidly for the better in terms of battery storage. I mean, we do have a problem with the strength of our grid, but that's the sort of problem that the British should be concentrating more on and less concentrating on things like fracking. And we're a small country, and it's not the ideal place for fracking
No.
with the issues that it raises over water supply and other things.
People living in Blackpool and getting earthquakes,
Yeah.
2.0 on the Richter scale.
But interesting subject, fracking, in some ways, because the whole industry is US dominated. So if we did allow fracking, it would be another case of welcoming US economic domination. So it should be resisted on that basis as well. That it's not a indigenous industry.
That's really interesting. So when it was being done before, because of course there was a ban on fracking in this country, but it was happening to some extent. The companies involved in that previously, were they US firms?
Yes.
Or?
Yeah. It was dominated by US. It still is.
That's fascinating.
Fracking is basically an industry, and it's driven down the cost of getting oil out of the ground, and it's been very effective at doing so. But like all these industries, it's an industry with scale, and where scale matters and technical knowledge matters, and we haven't built that up in this country, and the Americans have. And so I've met Texans who've come over here and been teaching us about fracking, but teaching us on the basis that they would do it for us.
So when you have people like Liz Truss saying that we need to have fracking because it's part of our energy independence, actually what you're saying is, well, to some extent it'd be the complete opposite. Maybe in terms of the balance of payments it might help or whatever, but broadly speaking, this would be an industry that's controlled by American firms.
I suppose what it shows is there are two elements of independence, aren't there? There's whether it comes from your own country, it would be independent in that sense. Whether it's controlled from your own country and whether the profits go to your own country is the other question, and I think it wouldn't be. I think it'd be a US-dominated industry. Britain's done relatively well in the dirty business of oil, partly because of its imperial past. But we've still got two big oil companies with Shell and BP. But even those, as I've said in the book, even those are their shareholder register is 30% owned by American institutions and individuals. But so we're more energy independent than some countries. But I think of the dirty sort of energy. And considering that it's so windy here, we really haven't taken proper advantage of wind. Partly because the Conservatives for so long were reluctant to have onshore wind, just because it was unpopular in the shires.
What would you prefer, onshore or offshore?
Both. Offshore is going very well in the sense the technology is allowing the build of very large turbines, and they should do both. The great thing about wind is it blows more at the time of year we need energy in the winter, and it blows at night time. So it's got these two advantages over solar. But solar's been very effective too, and particularly near the coasts where there's more radiation, and in the south of England, solar is making a big contribution.
Yeah, it's funny when people say there's no sunshine in England, so how can solar work? And you think, well, photosynthesis is a solar-powered chemical reaction. So look how green the country is. It's...
Well, I think they're confusing sunshine with radiation.
Yeah.
Even when there's a cloud cover, there's still some radiation, and that's where you get your energy.
Where do you think this comes from? This is a slight detour, but you've got a lot of people on the right of politics at the moment poo-pooing renewables. They'll say, well, solar and wind is not enough. And we can have a conversation about the mix, and I think we need some nuclear and so on, because we have quite long, cold winters, and it's quite dark at the precise moment that solar exposure is the lowest. So Northern Europe and Canada and Russia is different to California. I get it. But they're poo-pooing something like solar, and I'll respond and say, well, my mother-in-law has solar panels, and her electricity bill last month was £6 or something. Why are you saying that's a bad thing? No sensible, normal person, whether they vote Labour, Tory, Lib Dem, or none of the above, they will think that's a good thing. It's the same with electric cars. They have some downsides. Very heavy. The infrastructure to charge them is quite difficult and complex to roll out. But if you've got a drive and you've got a charging station you can fit in your own home, they're fantastic. Where do you think this resistance to those kinds of technologies comes from? Because it doesn't seem rational to me anymore.
No, it's not rational. In our house in South London, we haven't got any solar on the main roof, but we've got solar on the shed, solar on a couple of other roofs, and we produce more electricity than we use.
Wow.
So we're a net power station, rather tiny one. And a lot of people could do that if they happened. Mostly people, you couldn't do it if you live in a flat usually, but most house owners could do that. And seems to, and we have an electric car which is within that charge, within that statement. So we still produce more, even taking account of the power for the car. And I don't mean to sound complacent about this, because a lot of people could do it. So I think the resistance.
So hold on, is that in March that's happening? Is that at the moment?
That's taking across the whole year.
Right. So that's pretty impressive, though.
Yeah, we're a net producer of not of energy, of electricity.
Of course.
So we make as much electricity as we use.
And you're powering your car.
Yes, including the powering of the car, which, to be honest, we don't use very much, but we do use. I think the resistance comes partly from reaction to change, partly because there is no real effective lobby for the renewable industry, whereas there are strong lobbies for the hydrocarbon industries. So I think and for that matter, there's a good lobby for nuclear. So I think there's an imbalance there. As you know, things get into the newspaper not by chance, and not just because they're news. They get placed there.
Yeah.
People who have an interest in getting stories published.
I don't know if are you familiar with that sort of mid-wit meme? You know, this.
What's that?
You've got the bell curve, you know, and you've got somebody who's not very intelligent and somebody who's hyper intelligent, and they basically say the same thing, and then you have the mid-wit person who says something different. And I think one of the sort of low and high intelligence sort of conclusions is that, you know, most things in the media are crap. You know, like it's something that, you know, my sort of peasant great-grandfather in Iran might say, but it's also something that I think a very august, intelligent person would say, very well-read person. He was intelligent, of course, in a different way. The older I get, the more I realise that's the case. On nuclear, because you said it's a hidden cost that we don't really integrate into our liabilities as a country, are you pro, because that sounds like an anti-nuclear statement. Are you pro or anti-nuclear in terms of the UK's energy mix?
I'm very cautious nuclear, because I think we tend to be not taking enough account of the costs of nuclear waste. And we tend to think, well, we can just bag it up and let future generations deal with it. And I think that's unfair on future generations. I think we've trashed our environment, but we've also left such a terrible legacy for younger people, whether it's in terms of debt, student debt, the housing situation, and the work situation. So I think to leave them with yet more waste to clear up is unfair. So I think until nuclear waste is better understood and more fully addressed, and nuclear waste is fully processed, I think we should be very careful about solving our short-term problem and creating hazardous materials that last for hundreds of years.
Your next book is on debt, right?
I am writing a book on debt, yes.
Maybe I shouldn't say that, but it's something that people are going to be talking about a lot in the coming weeks, sadly, because of course the yields on UK gilts are widening. It's becoming more expensive for the government to borrow or to sell its debt on international markets.
Yes.
How important is that going to be? And is that something that's now at the back of the mind of somebody like Rachel Reeves, Keir Starmer, basically every time they open their mouth?
Totally. The discussions during the Iran war, the discussions have been about what will happen to the price of energy for consumers. And it seems to me that is a factor. It's important and it's a consideration, but it's not the only thing. And I'm sure Reeves and Starmer are concerned about a much wider thing than that. So it's also about whether a downturn in the economy will cut the tax base and make it unaffordable for us to pay the things that we've committed to paying, including, for example, pensions. It's also about, as you say, what will happen to the interest rates. Interest rates have gone up above 5%. Now, the sums are quite straightforward. If you've got £3 trillion of borrowing and interest rates are 5%, it takes time to work through, but if they're 5%, that means £150 billion of interest each year, which is 15% of the tax take. Bear in mind, we spend another 150 billion on the state pension. That means interest in the state pension take you to 30% of the tax take. And the NHS costs just over 200 billion. So we're now at 50% of the tax take just to pay for NHS, state pension, and our interest payments. So I think the bit you're asking about, the interest payments, it's critical. I mean, they were hoping that it would go down below 4%, and the difference of 1% is, it's 30 30 billion a year.
Which is, I think the policing budget for England and Wales is about 18, 19 billion.
Yep.
So it's, it's an extra 50% above the policing budget. I mean, this is really extraordinary. When Liz Truss came in with the kamikaze budget, Aaron Kwasi-Kwarteng, I remember, I think in one calendar year, the costs of servicing interest went up by about 35 billion, or maybe in about 6 months. And that's, basically twice the policing budget of England and Wales. And it just wasn't being factored into the conversation, again, particularly from the right. They talk about, we need to reduce income tax and reduce corporation tax and reduce that. Okay, well, great. But in an aging population where, like you say, 10, 15% of your GDP is going on servicing public debt, that's simply not possible. You cannot have a low tax economy.
No.
Is that ever going to cut through to these people? Because I know with ideologues, it's hard to cut through to them because they have ideological claims they firmly believe in. But because they haven't changed their tune since Liz Truss.
Well, I think what would cut through would be a financial crisis. The people are, what's in the background that people are sort of referring to obliquely is basically the bond markets. And the bond markets aren't they are individuals, a group of individuals who are assessing Britain's ability to pay its debts and are deciding how much they're going to pay for bonds. And the rate they pay for bonds reflects their attitude, their appraisal of the state of the British economy and the willingness of the government to make difficult decisions in order to keep the economy so that it can pay its debts. So I think we're in a situation where there are these shadow actors behind the scenes, and one of the biggest is the bond markets.
Final question. Given we're moving seemingly to a more multipolar world, by which I mean more of global GDP is outside of what we consider the West historically, technological innovation is becoming more diffuse. China's getting very good at some things. For instance, global cities aren't just in North America and Europe anymore. You've got Singapore, you did have Dubai until about 10 minutes ago, other places as well. So that's changing. We are moving towards a more multipolar world. The question is how quickly and what does that look like? But it's strange that we're moving towards multipolarity, and at the same time, the British establishment is cleaving ever closer to the United States with the presumption of unipolarity. One, why do you think that is? And two, what do you think a sensible foreign policy looks like in the changing world that now confronts us?
Yes, well, old habits die hard, and we're looking increasingly isolated, having aligned ourselves with a bloc 2,000 miles away, when there's another important political and economic bloc 20 miles away. I think we need to continue to be friendly to the Americans, and like the French, we can be allies of the Americans, but the French model is far better. Allies, but independent. We should make build much closer links with Europe. The Labour Party in recent weeks have said as much, but they're hesitant to say it too loudly because they don't want anyone to think that they're in favour of rejoining the EU, which I am, by the way. I think it would just make a lot of sense. But even if we don't rejoin the EU, we should be closer to them. And the EU was essentially an economic union, but it's sort of economic and political, but it's morphing into something that's looking like it needs to be something more military as well. And it seems to me we should be throwing in our lot with the French and the Germans rather than being a sort of aircraft carrier off Europe for the Americans.
I said final question, but actually just building on this, because I was at a debate the best part of a year ago now about should we end the special relationship? And I'm happy to say it to you, I plagiarized tons of your arguments, right? At the start of my 5-minute speech, I said, I came here, I paid with Apple Pay on my Apple phone, on my iPhone, and this is being streamed on YouTube, and you bought your tickets through Ticketmaster, and the payment system for unheard is Stripe, blah, 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 blah. All the digital infrastructure is American-owned, American firms. And actually, over the course of the evening, and of course, this is unheard, most of the people are on the right. There was a lady who came up to me afterwards. She was from somewhere in Central Europe. I think she was maybe Polish. She said, I work in equity for an equity fund. You're absolutely right. Everything you said is correct. The Brits should be more assertive about their own, possibilities and opportunities. So that was very much a centre-right audience, and they were listening to what I said, and some of them were even persuaded. Has that been your experience with this stuff over the last couple of years? I do occasionally read the Telegraph or something, and I'll see your name cited.
Yes, very much. I think I'm really pleased that it's been a sort of wake-up call that people have been waking up to. Yeah, and people have been saying to me, this is what I've always thought, but I didn't dare say it. And so that people are realising that the special relationship is essentially, at the moment, it's an exploitative relationship. I would even go so far as to say, in many ways, it's been an abusive relationship. Although that's obviously a term with other connotations that I don't intend. Of course, we've got a special relationship in the sense that we speak a similar language. There are a lot of cultural and other links. And just speaking for myself, I've got American cousins, and a lot of us have got friends who've moved to America or friends who've come from America. But that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about something quite different. We're talking about politics and economics. And in terms of this special political relationship, that's the one that I think has become abusive and exploitative, and that Keir Starmer's in a difficult position, but he should do more to assert independence. What's quite interesting is, at least because Donald Trump is so unpopular in Europe and in the UK as well, the extent to which Starmer has asserted his independence in the last week or two has meant that it's increased his popularity. So that's a very encouraging thing, that we've got to a political situation where you say you want to be more independent of America and you get more votes for it. So I don't think the May elections, it'll be a direct result of that. The May elections won't be quite as disastrous for Labour as we had expected.
I think that's entirely right. They're going to be very bad, by the way, and Reform are going to do very well. But my wife's a counsellor. I probably shouldn't say publicly what she tells me, but she's gone out canvassing. She goes out canvassing twice a week, and she's basically said since Iran, lots of people who were not going to vote Labour or wavering are just revolted by what Reform and the Tories initially said, and their sort of gung-ho attitude to it.
Yes. So they're being punished for expressing over-loyalty to the US, to saying we should have joined in the war straight away. And that's encouraging from the point of view of Vassal State. It shows that many of the normal people don't want to have that sort of relationship where we follow like a lapdog in the tracks of an American military adventurist master.
So daft them, Zach Polanski, who I really like, by the way, looked like Henry Kissinger. Angus, a pleasure to talk to you again. And for those watching or listening, Vassal State, it is fabulous. It's been a couple of years, but it's still very relevant. And of course, when your next book is out, we'll have you back on, Angus.
Thank you very much, Aaron. Thank you.